Hello, and today we're going to talk about the different soil mediums that I'm always asked about here. And so I thought I would do a little sample and maybe talk about each one and how. And the very first one we're going to talk about today is black soil, and it's called garden earth. Quite often it's sold to you as screened topsoil or screened garden earth. And that's a good way to start. It usually gets a lot of the big lumps and chunks out of it, and it has little small bits in it. A lot of people complain to me that their garden earth becomes hard packed and completely packed down. Part of the problem with that is we don't have a lot of organic matter in this type of earth once the topsoil is in the garden. So the best way to loosen it up would be to add a rough cut peat, which is a sphagnum peat moss, or compost, and that will help loosen the soil tremendously. Because perlite, it does get a lot of moisture sunk into it, but it does tend to make your peat and your mix, if you're adding this into a container, very porous, and so the moisture runs straight through your pot. So if you're putting perlite into your garden soil, that's just great. That'll loosen it up and it's very light. But if you add extra perlite into a peat base into your containers, you'll discover that your containers will dry out very, very quickly. So adding perlite to your containers won't work, but adding perlite into your garden beds certainly does. The next two types of soil here that I want to talk about is a professional brand, which is this one right here, versus a cheaper department store type of container mix. This container mix is a professional peat cut. It has perlite already in it, as well as a shot of fertilizer, and you can see that the peat moss is long fibers. That's really what you want in a mix, especially when you're going to put it in your planter boxes, and it will reach out and hold the moisture much longer in your containers than this mix, which is a much cheaper mix, and you can see it has very little to no fibers in it whatsoever. And so this one, the plants don't root as well down into it, and it won't hold the moisture for very long. You're always best to go with a better professional brand mix that you would buy at a greenhouse or a garden center, and because they are generally a longer fiber mix. The next thing that people always ask me about is sand. Please don't add sand to any of your gardens. It's very, very difficult. Sand plugs all the pores and makes it incredibly heavy. This is shredded bark. I'm not a really big shredded bark fan. I don't like putting bark on my beds. Firstly, perennials don't really like growing around bark chips. As you probably have already discovered, they tend to pull away from that. But the bark is to hold in the moisture once you've applied it onto your garden soil after you've planted your plants. The problem is that you can't really see underneath of it to see how dry the soil is underneath. So it does give people a little bit of a false security because they think their soil underneath is nice and wet, and you can't actually see it. A very common mistake that people often make is they take topsoil and they mix into their containers when they're putting them together in the spring. The problem is that when you water those containers that have topsoil in them with our tap water, which tends to be high in lime because of our water source, it makes a small chemical reaction, and you are sort of making cement when you mix high bicarbonated of lime water and a clay-based soil. And so you'll find often a white ring, or the pots become very hard and compact. That is because you've put our tap water, because you're watering on a regular basis, in with the garden soil. The best thing to use in your containers is always a professional kind of mix with a heavy, long cut fiber.